My name is Amber, and this is Connecting for Recovery. We are a unofficial, according to 12-step meeting or program. However, we are inclusive of all types of recovery, all types of 12-step. Language that you'll hear in here is related to a lot of different 12-step language, and our definition of recovery is working towards our truest and highest self. So if you hear any acronyms or any words or meetings mentioned and you're not sure what that is, feel free to pop it in the chat, and myself or one of the wise ones in the room will be happy to share what that is. I feel like I haven't been here in forever. I want to start off tonight with getting back into the habit of focusing on not just on pathology, but on recovery as well. And how do we walk that out? What does it look like? It's helpful. You guys know my cheesy mantra, knowledge is power. PBS kids, thank you very much. And sometimes I, as a responsible adult, cognitively know what that means. And do I know how to do it? Hell no. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, and we're going to use the ACA meditation from today. ACA is Adult Child of Alcoholic and Dysfunctional Families. You don't have to come from an addictive family to participate or qualify. And it is my own personal recovery program. And the topic today, if I read the right email, because I'm a little bit behind, was guilt. Is guilt, not was. It's not dead. And being able to talk about where does guilt come from, and how does that manifest and get in our way as we become adults. So when you think of the term guilt, I really like to create a discrepancy between guilt and shame. Because growing up, I really didn't know what the difference was. And I got to be honest, I was good into my adult years before I actually could probably tell you what the difference in guilt and shame was. And I think that's pretty normal, whatever that word means. I think that's pretty typical. Because culturally, I noticed that it's not always used correctly. So being able to look at the difference in guilt and shame, I think, could be really helpful when we're looking at recovery and what does it mean. So part of our story, and if you work with a member of my team, your recovery looks like reparenting. It looks like what part of my backstory or my childhood is showing up today in my adult life. What got triggered? What is happening today that is activating me in a way that goes all the way back to a really bad story that never got repaired. And as I recognize and notice that, what do I need to do about it? How can I reparent it? What can I do to not continue to stay stuck in that loop of that story? So to start talking about that, let's talk about the difference in guilt and shame. Brene Brown does a beautiful job of this too, if you're a Brene groupie. So guilt is a reaction, response, emotion that typically elicits an action. The action for most people is an apology. I did something happened. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Sometimes there's a spiral after, and sometimes that's just it. Shame is, I feel bad about who I am rather than I feel bad about what I did, which is guilt. The reason this is so important is because when we use them interchangeably, it doesn't allow us to recognize what's happening in our body. With guilt, there's an action that happens, and usually with the action, there's remorse, and then there's some type of forgiveness of me or another person or whatever. And guilt is much healthier than shame. So if I were to if I were to sculpt shame, let's do that. If I were to sculpt shame, I would go into a fetal position. The purpose or the intention of that is to show isolation, is to show detaching, coming away from, disconnection. If guilt is I feel bad about what I did, shame is I feel bad about who I am. And I want you to take a moment and just think back to your backstory, to childhood, to teenage years, to young adult, whatever comes up for you. Think back to when you were disciplined, and you may not identify with that word. You may say, I wasn't disciplined, I was punished. Those are two different things. That's a whole nother, we'll do that next week. And I want to say what is true for you, and I don't want to minimize anything. So I want you to think about back to your childhood, teenage years, parents, grandparents, whoever was overseeing you. And I want you to think about the words, the phrases, the nonverbal communication that was used to get you to stop doing something. A healthy comment from a disciplinarian, an authoritative person, would have sounded something like, Amber, what you're doing right now, you could get really, really hurt. And I don't want you to get hurt. And I know you don't want to get hurt. So let's come back over here and play, or let's go inside and get a snack. Unhealthy reaction to that would have been, I don't even want to say this to you guys. I'm a little worried about triggering you. So everybody take a little inch back from the computer for a second. Just humor me. Amber Teresa Whitaker, what the hell are you doing? I don't know about you guys, but it didn't matter how old I was when I heard that. My ass stopped in my tracks. Didn't move. Okay, you can come back up now. Thank you. Didn't want you to absorb that energy. Let's clear that out. So the difference in the two was one gave options, expressed authority, and focused on safety, but gave choices. The other one was shaming, punitive, and degrading. That's the difference in discipline and punishment. So when you think back to your backstory, how were you spoken to, or what nonverbal did you get from a parent that you knew just to stop? They didn't even need to say anything. And would you identify that as shaming? You are bad. Or would you identify that as what you did was wrong, unsafe, or scary? So when we look at shame and guilt, it's really necessary to be able to create a discrepancy or a distinction in, well, I'm saying I feel guilty, but actually, I think this might be shame. And why is that important? Well, that's important because so often, if it wasn't that beautiful modeling of, Amber, that is unsafe, please don't do that. Let's do this or this, versus calling me by my full name and cussing at me. The difference in those two is the reminder that I do to me what was done to me when it wasn't repaired. I do to me what was done to me when it wasn't repaired. That's trauma. I'm causing me trauma. I'm doing to me what was done to me. Because when I internalize, when I shame someone else or judge someone else, when um, my boss looks over at me in a meeting, this is funny because I'm the boss. When my boss looks over at me in a meeting and gives me a look, and I feel like I become this big, I shrink. That's a response to my backstory. And that's not, I feel so guilty because I didn't finish that project. That's not guilt. When I shrink down and want to be the size of an ant, or when I buckle up and I want to punch someone, that's shame. Those are body reactions to an event that usually, when it's a trauma trigger, doesn't match the trigger. The body reactions don't always match what's happening. And I don't just do that to others, I do that to me by for years, I think my mom assumed my sisters packed my lunch, and they didn't. And so I'm going to school every day not eating. And as an adult, I get too busy and I start ADSing and I don't stop to eat. I'm doing to me what was done to me, because the message that was sent to me is bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, basic needs, food, shelter, water, isn't even being met. Yeah, because work is more important than stopping to get food. It's not. And that's the message that I'm sending myself and my little girl. If I went to my parents and said I'm sick and they didn't believe me, I started to think maybe I'm not sick. Like questioning my own reality of, well, mom says I'm not sick. I guess I'm not sick. If I don't have a fever and I'm not puking, I must be fine. And as an adult, if I don't have a fever and I'm not puking, I don't go to the doctor. I challenge that a lot. And that was very common practice for me. What are they going to do for me? I would just minimize it. I'm doing to me what was done to me. I'm shaming me, which is affecting my worth. It's not guilting me. Research shows that there is 100% correlation with shame, self-talk, and depression, addiction, and suicide. That's pretty fucking scary, right? That's scary to me. There's 100% correlation with shame, self-talk, depression, addiction, and suicide. Well, I wonder why, because I'm beating myself up, literally. And when they did studies on teenagers and they were able to teach them to use guilt self-talk, what's the difference in shame self-talk and guilt self-talk? Shame self-talk is me telling me I'm defective. Shame self-talk is me saying, thank you, Elisa. Shame self-talk is me saying I'm the problem, me saying I'm bad, me saying I'm defective. In whatever words, that's the message that's sent to me. Guilt self-talk says what I did was not okay, and I should probably do something about that. It's separate from me. It's separate from my soul and my identity. It was just a behavior. And man, I wish I wouldn't have done that, is what guilt self-talk sounds like. I don't accept a responsibility for being defective or bad or wrong or yucky. So when we think about the 100% correlation with depression, addiction, and suicide with shame self-talk, fuck yeah, we need guilt self-talk. How do we do that? Right? Like, how do I figure out how to do that? Because there was an inverse correlation with depression, addiction, and suicide. Because when I'm able to recognize guilt and just create the discrepancy with guilt and shame, I'm able to recognize that this was just a mistake and it's just a behavior. It's not me. I'm not the problem. So when we walk that out in recovery, that's very much the walkout of that is number one, I have to have awareness of what my narrative and my self talk even sounds like. And if you worked with me, you know this because that's one of the first activities that I offer. And I always give the caveat of it's going to get a little scary. That's why we numb and medicate so we don't have to listen to the shit up here because this is brutal. And when you start listening to it, it's going to get scary. And that's what we're going to change. But until I have awareness of something as a problem, I'm not going to have buy in to change it. I don't have a reason to change it if I don't acknowledge it. But when I start listening to it and I start writing down the shit that I say to myself, which I would never say to another person, it starts to create some feeling. And I don't like that feeling. You guys remember, got to feel to heal? When I become aware and I listen and I connect with the feeling, why am I doing this? This is bad. And then what we also start to notice is the thoughts in the narrative, what we're saying, what we're doing to ourselves is what was done to us. So it's not even my freaking voice, right? That's what really pissed me off too. So when we walk this out in recovery, I'm going to give another tool at the end, but when we walk this out in recovery, it is first shifting from shame to guilt and then recognizing how am I doing to me what was done to me? And do I believe that? And do I want to even continue that? If not, then I'm going to need some support on creating a new neural pathway because that's the road I've been paving for the last few decades, if that makes sense. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. I wanted to create a discrepancy in guilt and shame and be able to recognize how guilt self-talk is so much healthier than shame self-talk. And how do I nurture me instead of hurt me? I'm going to open it up to you guys for experience, strength, and hope. In the beginning of our meeting, I was talking of recovery and breaking some of the habits is transitioning from shame self-talk into guilt self-talk and being able to recognize what each of them feels like because it will be very different. Guilt is about a behavior that elicits an action. Shame is about me that causes detachment, isolation, retreating. When I'm breaking a habit, when I recognize my narrative and I recognize, shit, I would never say the shit I say to myself to someone else. So often, the way that we start walking that out differently is by looking at or thinking about what one might say to their pet, what one might say to their child if you have a child. Um, my pets are my children and I have children. The joke on CFR is it Amber's skinned babies or is it Amber's fur babies? Yeah, I don't know. That just happened one night. But being able to think about the facial expression, the tone of my voice, what I would say and do to them is so much gentler than what I would say and do to me, even in the silence. Sometimes my silence is my punishment to me. I witnessed and experienced that a lot. Silence is the most powerful form of control. So, the tool that I want to recommend is reparenting. It is whatever I would say or do to my little precious tiny ones. Whether that's my pets, my kids, my best friend, my whatever, my plants. Um, so in reparenting, I want to start to notice my narrative. And if you're struggling to figure out, shit, is that guilt or is that shame? Write it down and then read it out loud. Your body will tell you. If you read it out loud and you go, ouch, it's shame. I got to feel to heal. So as you're becoming more and more aware of that, being able to use things like writing it out, recognizing the body reaction or the body response will lead you in that direction. And I know I'm talking around this a little bit, but I want to highlight it because 93% of communication is nonverbal. We can even be nonverbal with me and me. I can look at myself in a way that looks just like the way my mom used to look at me. So being able to recognize that it doesn't have to be spoken in my head or out loud. It can also be the feeling that I have about myself. That can be really hard to acknowledge and recognize because the reason there is that 100% correlation with addiction is because when we feel shame as children, we internalize that and it becomes the way that we communicate with ourselves. We can't live in pain that long, so we have to numb and medicate. That doesn't have to be pills and alcohol and what we see on TV. It can be shopping, food. It can be scrolling TikTok. It can be gambling. It can be sex. It can be porn. It can be work, exercise. We can turn anything into a numbing and medicating tool. And as a culture, that's what we do because we're in a lot of pain. It's not permissive for us in our culture to feel what we feel because that's seen as weakness, especially as women and men. So being able to reparent that part of me, just because my parents didn't have it to give to me, does not mean I spend the rest of my life without it. It does mean I start recognizing how I hurt me unintentionally, subconsciously. And by bringing that into my state of awareness, that's how I get to live in recovery. Because I'm going to make mistakes. I'm not going to do this all right. And with some of it, I won't even know how to do it, which is why we do things like group therapy and workshops.